Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tutorial and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today I'm going to be covering one of the weirder and more confusing mechanics in Baldur's Gate 3, save DCs. Saving throws are one of the most bizarre mechanics in BG3. The difficulty class of spells, items, Illithid powers, and various other effects in the game use completely different rules and are full of exceptions, traps, and bugs. So knowing how to build your characters to make sure enemies will actually fail their saves against your effects can be really difficult. Even now, years after the game released, I still see a ton of confusion around this topic. I get probably at least one question every video that I post about this, and often many more. So today I'm going to try to clear that up. Once you understand how these work, you should no longer see wildly low success chances on your spells for completely unclear reasons, and you should be able to use some of the most powerful items and abilities in the game without any issues. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Rosie O'Donnell for the $10 donation, John Walker for the $10, Imperial Fish for the $25, and Duke and Arcade for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends. I really appreciate your support. It really means a lot to me. Alright, let's clear up some confusion. So before we get really deep into the weeds on this weird mechanic, let's quickly go over the basics. If you already know what a saving throw is, what a save DC is, and why they're important, you can feel free to skip to the next part of the video. Basically, anytime something bad happens to a creature, they're going to roll a saving throw in order to try to avoid that effect. If you step in a trap, you're going to roll a save to try to avoid taking damage. If an enemy throws a fireball at you, you're going to roll a saving throw in order to dodge it and avoid taking some of the damage from that fireball. If you try to mind control an enemy, they're going to roll a saving throw in order to resist your mind control. This is true both for player characters and for enemies. Essentially, any time something happens to a character that isn't a direct attack roll, it uses a saving throw to decide whether it happens or not. So most of the time when you're casting a spell and you hover over an enemy, the game will show you a percentage chance. What it's actually showing you is the percent chance that that enemy's saving throw will beat your save difficulty class, and that they will then resist the effect. For most characters, their saving throws use one of the 6 attributes. So for most spell effects and other effects that use saving throws, they're going to target one of the attributes. For example, a fireball you resist with your dexterity because you're dodging out of the way. A mind control effect like hold person you resist with your wisdom because you're using your willpower to resist it. The actual number that you roll for your saving throw is 1d20 plus your ability modifier in the relevant ability, plus your proficiency bonus if you're proficient in that saving throw, and that's going to depend on what class you are. So, for example, a fighter is proficient in strength saves and will get a bonus to their strength saves based on their character level, and then any additional bonuses that you have. What this means is that for most characters at low levels, their saving throws are going to be somewhere between 13 and 15 on average, and at high levels, they're going to be somewhere between 17 and 20 on average. And that will be compared to the difficulty class of making that saving throw to see whether they succeed. If you meet or beat the save DC, then you succeed, and the bad thing doesn't happen or happens with reduced effect. So now we know that when you're saving against something, you need to meet or exceed the save DC in order to avoid that effect. But what is actually a save DC? Save DC in this case stands for difficulty class, and it just measures how hard it is to avoid having something bad happen to you. A more powerful enemy will be better at casting spells, and so their spells will be harder for your character to resist. A more difficult effect to avoid will be harder, so it'll have a higher difficulty class. For example, dodging a falling feather is going to be easier than dodging a falling building, so the save DC for that would be correspondingly lower. The higher the save DC, the harder it is to make the save. The lower the save DC, the easier it is to make the save. Every effect in the game that targets a saving throw has its own save DC, so that you know how high the saving throw has to be in order to resist it. But how do you actually calculate that number? Well, that, unfortunately, is where it gets really confusing. In Baldur's Gate 3, how to calculate your save DC uses a ton of different formulas and different mathematical equations for whichever different type of effect it is. And so knowing which governs what and how to maximize them can be very important for building your characters because it will let you build characters such that their effects are as difficult to resist as possible. So in Baldur's Gate 3, there are 5 different types of save DC, and they each have their own formula in order to determine how difficult it is to resist that type of effect. This is true both for you and for enemies. So if you cast a spell, it will use the same calculation to determine the spell save DC that enemies have to save against. Then if an enemy casts a spell, it will also use the same spell DC equation. Most mechanics in the game are reciprocal, so they work the same for you and enemies. There are some exceptions to this, but for the most part, these formulas will be true both for your party and for the enemies. The 5 types of saving throw in the game are fixed save DCs, concentration saves, which use their own formula, maneuver DCs, which are for physical actions and things like tripping an enemy, spell saves, which are the ones you're most often going to encounter, where you are casting a spell on an enemy or an enemy is casting a spell on you, and then item save DCs. Item DCs are the ones that are unique to Baldur's Gate 3. It's not a mechanic that exists in tabletop D&D, and this is where a lot of the confusion arises, because item DCs are both complex to determine and full of bugs and exceptions. So we're going to spend the most time on those, but we'll go over how all of these different save DCs are calculated. First up, the simplest of the 5, fixed save DCs. This is a fixed number, so the DC is calculated by, it's a number. For example, 12. This is usually used for consumable items or story effects, so a trap that exists in the world will always have the same DC no matter what level your party is when they encounter it, and you'll just have to make the saving throws against it based on the difficulty class that the developers set for that particular encounter. Other effects that use this are things like consumable items. For example, if you throw a bottle of grease at an enemy, the DC for them to avoid slipping on that grease puddle is always going to be 12. So if you throw a bottle of grease at an enemy, they always have to meet or beat a 12 on their dexterity saving throw against it to avoid slipping and falling. This is different from if you cast the grease spell, because that will use your spell save DC, but a lot of consumable items and similar effects have fixed numbers that are associated with them. There are also a couple spells and other items in the game that are bugged and have fixed DCs, even though they're supposed to use one of the other formulas. You don't really need to know any of those exceptions, but basically a fixed DC for any particular item is just a number, and that number will always be the same. So very simple. The second type of save DC in the game is concentration saves. So this is used when a character is concentrating on a spell. If your party member is concentrating on Hold Person or Haste, and they take damage or something otherwise disrupts their concentration, they're going to have to make a concentration save, which is a constitution saving throw, in order to maintain concentration on that spell. If they fail the save, they lose the spell, and whatever effect they're concentrating on stops working. Again, this is the same for your characters and for the enemies. The way that this is calculated is the difficulty class you have to meet in order to maintain concentration on a spell is equal to half the damage that you took that caused you to make the concentration save. So anytime you're concentrating on a spell and you take any amount of damage, you have to make a saving throw in order to maintain concentration, and the save DC is half the damage you took. There's a minimum of 10 on this. So if you take 1 damage, you still need to beat a DC of 10 in order to maintain concentration on your spell. If you take 100 damage at once, you would need to make a DC of 50, which for most characters is going to be impossible. So this scales based on the amount of incoming damage. It's always a Constitution save, and it is affected by most bonuses to Constitution saving throws, so your con save bonuses will apply when you're trying to maintain concentration on a spell. There's no way to change the save DC on concentration spells other than just doing more damage, because it's always calculated based on the damage that you dealt. The third type of save DC in the game is maneuver DC. So this one is kind of a house rule for Baldur's Gate 3. There are some effects that work like this in tabletop, but in Baldur's Gate 3, a lot more effects have been changed to use this DC calculation, so it comes up a lot more often. This is particularly important for martial characters. If you're playing a fighter or a monk, this is probably the one that you care about, because this is how enemies resist effects from those types of characters. To determine your character's maneuver DC, which is going to be used for all of their physical actions, as well as a lot of special weapon actions and things like shield bashing, the formula is 8 plus your proficiency bonus plus the higher of your strength or dexterity bonus. Your proficiency bonus is equal to 2 at first level and increases up to +4 at later levels. So for a character at level 1 with 16 strength, their maneuver DC would be 13, meaning enemies have to meet 13 or higher in order to resist their effects, which of course is 8 plus 2 from their proficiency plus 3 from their +3 strength bonus for having 16 strength. At level 12, a character with 20 strength, which is fairly typical, would have a maneuver DC of 17. 8 plus 4 for their proficiency bonus plus 5 for their strength bonus. So enemies would have to meet or beat a 17 in order to resist their effects. This bonus is also affected by most, but not all, save DC items. So items that increase your save DC, a lot of them do work on maneuver DC, but some of them only specifically work on spell save DC, which we'll talk about in a second. And a lot of effects that increase your save DCs do not work on maneuver DCs. So these will typically be a little lower, because a lot of effects that you can use to boost them will not work on them compared to spell save. These are used for pretty much every physical action. So things like Battle Master maneuvers, which is, of course, where we get the name, use your maneuver DC. If you use Tripping Attack as a Battle Master, an enemy is going to have to beat your maneuver DC in order to avoid getting tripped. A monk will use maneuver DC for their Stunning Strike, as well as any other monk weapon abilities that they have. This is actually a difference from tabletop, where it doesn't use maneuver DC in tabletop D&D, but in Baldur's Gate 3, Monk Stunning Strike does use your maneuver DC. So, and having high strength or high dexterity on your monk will make your stuns harder to resist. It's also used for most weapon actions, so the short rest weapon actions that most weapons have. These will calculate how difficult they are to resist using your maneuver DC. Things like shield bashing with a shield will use your maneuver DC. They finally fixed the bug, so this should actually work properly. It used to use your spell DC, but it's supposed to use maneuver DC and has finally been fixed, so shield bashing should work for that. So basically anything physical that you do that's not casting a spell is going to use your maneuver DC, which is going to be calculated using this formula. The fourth type of save DC is the one players are going to encounter most commonly, and this is your spell DC. So for any character casting spells, their DC and their chances to hit are going to be based on their casting stat, very similar to maneuver DC using strength or dexterity, but for a spellcaster, it's going to be one of the mental stats. This is the normal one, so it's going to be the one that you're going to encounter most often throughout the game, and this is what the formulas for this category of difficulty classes are typically based on. The formula for your spell save DC is 8 at base, plus your proficiency bonus, plus your casting stat. So, just like maneuver DC, it's going to use a stat modifier, plus your proficiency, plus 8. In this case, your casting stat is going to be determined by the class that's casting the spell. This is used for most spells and for almost all spells except the ones that are bugged. And most classed abilities for caster classes will also use their spell save DC if it's something that you resist. So something like a Glamour Bard using Mantle of Majesty the resistance against the command effect from that will be calculated using the Glamour Bard's save DC. The way that you calculate this is going to be determined by the class that's casting the spell. So whenever you cast a spell, that will always use the casting stat for the class that learned the spell, and that's true regardless of whether you multiclass. For example, if you are playing a bard, then you're always going to use charisma for casting your bard spells. And if you're playing a bard cleric multiclass, then your bard spells will always use charisma, and your cleric spells will always use wisdom to determine how difficult they are to resist. What that means is that if you're a bard with a 1-level dip in cleric, you probably don't care that much about having high wisdom, but you really want high charisma, because that's going to be important for determining how difficult it is for enemies to resist your bard spells. If you get a spell from multiple sources, so if you have a spell that is available both to bards and clerics, for example, Healing Word. Healing Word doesn't have a DC to resist it, but the bonus that you get is determined by your casting stat. Then you get both versions of the spell, and you get to choose which one to use. So if you're a bard, cleric, multiclass, and you have Healing Word from both of them, you can cast it as a bard spell or as a cleric spell, depending on whether your charisma or your wisdom is higher. So choosing the right version of the spell to use when you're multiclassing is going to help make your spells as impactful as possible. Spell DCs also do include all wizard spells, even the ones that they learn from scrolls. So if you're a wizard and you're learning spells from a scroll, those will always use your intelligence, no matter how you've multiclassed your character. Even if you only have 1 level in wizard and are learning high-level wizard spells using the feature of wizards that lets them scribe scrolls of any level, those scrolls that you scribe will be wizard spells, so they will always use your intelligence, no matter what classes you take multiclassed and no matter what order you took your classes in. Any spell that's available from your actual casting is always going to use the casting stat for that class, no exceptions. So up until this point, all of that is hopefully fairly straightforward and fairly intuitive. Have high strength, you're good at knocking people over. Have high charisma, you're good at casting bard spells, because that's the stat that they use to determine how good their spells are. This is where things get confusing, and here is where I'm going to throw in a word of caution. If you are completely new to the game, you should be careful with this next bit of information. Up until this point, everything will make sense, and for 90% of your playtime, that's all you need to know, is that having high stats in the relevant area will make your spells harder to resist, more likely to hit when you attack with them, and enemies will have a harder time avoiding them. High charisma, good for bards, because it increases your spell save DC. This next part, though, with item save DC, is very confusing and weirdly set up. And so again, I want to say, if you're new to the game and just looking for a basic overview of the mechanics, it is safe to ignore this next part. Only dive in if you're looking for a deep dive in the weird mechanics of Baldur's Gate 3. So with that disclaimer out of the way, let's get into it. So, item DC. So this is the weird one in Baldur's Gate 3, and basically the reason why I made this video is because the rules that govern item DC are counterintuitive, baroque, and never explained anywhere in the game. And there's also a ton of misinformation online about how this actually works. So figuring out how this class of difficulty class actually functions and what formulas actually govern it and what things are affected by it can be very difficult because the information out there is not necessarily accurate. So, the way that item DC works is the formula is similar to the to your maneuver or spell DC. It's 8 plus your proficiency modifier plus your casting stat. But in this case, how the casting stat is determined is not just based on your classes. For your spell save DC, it's going to be whatever class gives you that spell. That's how you determine the DC. For your item DC, so this is for spells cast from directly from items, spells that you cast from scrolls, and your Illithid powers. The stat is determined by the most recent new casting class that you multiclassed into. So for a monoclass character, this is going to work just fine. It will be identical to your spell save DC, so if you're playing a monoclass character, you don't have to worry about your item DC being broken. But if you're playing a multiclass character, it's very easy to ruin your character's ability to use items effectively if you take the classes in the wrong order, because this is one of the only things in the entire game that cares about what order you took your classes in. The way that the stat is determined is by the most recent new casting class. So the class you took level 1 in most recently is going to determine your casting stat. It's also affected by most save DC increasing items, just like spell saves. And it's also important that some spells are bugged and use item save DC, in particular spells that have repeatable effects. So if you're casting Call Lightning, the first instance of Call Lightning is going to use your spell save DC, but every subsequent time you recast it, it's going to use your item save DC because of bugs. So this is obviously a little confusing, so let's break it down with some examples. So this cares about the order that you take your classes in. So for example, your item save DC, if you are a bard who then multiclasses into cleric, will use your wisdom, because cleric is the class you took most recently. Whereas if you're a cleric who multiclasses into bard, you're going to use your charisma for your item. It also only counts classes that have a casting ability, so classes that cast spells naturally. So if you're a bard who multiclasses into fighter, it won't change your item save DC. You're still going to use charisma for that. Unless you then take a casting subclass. So if you are a bard who multiclasses into fighter and then takes Eldritch Knight, when you hit level 3 and take Eldritch Knight, because that is a casting class, it's going to change your item DC to intelligence, because Eldritch Knights and fighters in general use intelligence as their casting class. I get that this is very confusing, but this is how it works. And of course, just to remind you, this is the save DC for spells that you cast from items, your Illithid powers, and spells you cast from scrolls. So if you are a sorcerer who learns Fireball and then takes a level of Cleric, and you just cast Fireball, it's still going to use your Charisma. But if you're a sorcerer who then takes a level of Cleric and uses a Scroll of Fireball, it will use your Wisdom. So that's why you might have seen those having wildly different success chances if you've been playing multi-classed characters, because they use different rules to determine your save DC. Give some more examples just to try to clarify things. If you have no caster levels, then this will use the default attribute for that class. So if you are a fighter using a Scroll of Fireball, it's going to determine the DC based on your intelligence. Fighters and rogues cast with intelligence. Barbarians cast with charisma, monks cast with wisdom. So if they use a scroll, or if those characters learn Illithid powers, those are going to be the stats that determine how those DCs are calculated. Paladins and rangers count even before they learn their spells. So if you are a bard who then takes a level of ranger, it's immediately going to switch your item DC to wisdom, even if you only take one level of ranger and don't actually ever learn any ranger spells. And the casting subclasses, Eldritch Knight and Arcane Trickster, count when you enter that casting subclass. So fighter at the first 2 levels will not change your save DC, but if you then take a third level of fighter and take Eldritch Knight, it'll change your DC to your item DC. And again, item DC only, not for spells you cast from your class levels. It'll change that to intelligence. But if you took Battle Master, then nothing would change, because that's not a casting class. So again, this formula is a little bizarre, so let's do some more specific examples of particular multi-class builds and see what casting stat they're going to use if they're using Illithid powers or casting spells from items. So if you're a cleric, you take 1 level of cleric, then 1 level of bard, and then 10 more levels of cleric. That character will use its charisma for its item casting stat, because bard is the most recent caster class that it took the first level of. The later levels of cleric do not matter for the item casting, the item save DC. It's only the most recent class you took level 1 in. A cleric who then takes a level of fighter, that doesn't change anything, because that's not a casting class. So if you go cleric 1, fighter 1, cleric 10, you're still going to use your wisdom. But if you go cleric 1, fighter 3, and take Eldritch Knight, and then 8 more levels of cleric, that character will use their intelligence, because Eldritch Knight is a casting class. Whereas if you took cleric 1, fighter, and then took Battlemaster fighter, it would still use its wisdom, because that's not a casting class. And again, I want to reiterate this because this is a really important point of confusion. This is not for your cleric spells, which will still use your wisdom in all of these examples, but for Illithid powers and spells that you cast from scrolls. A cleric who takes a level of Paladin and then 10 more levels of Cleric, is going to use your Charisma to cast their items, because Paladin, even though you haven't learned any Paladin spells with only 1 level of Paladin, still counts as a casting class for the purpose of determining your save DC. Warlock, Paladin, Bard, and then Cleric, that character is going to use its Wisdom, because Cleric is the most recent character class that it took level 1 in. Whereas Warlock, Paladin, Cleric, and then Bard, that character is going to use its Charisma, because Bard is the most recent class that it took level 1 in. So the things that it cares about for your item save DC is just the most recent casting class that you took the first level of, and the casting subclasses count as soon as you enter that subclass. Later levels of Eldritch Knight, similar to later levels of Cleric, don't matter. It's only when you first enter that class that it changes your item save DC. So what all that means when you're building your character, of course, is that if you're a character that wants to use Illithid powers offensively, or cast items from scrolls, or cast spells from scrolls, or cast spells from a staff, you should arrange your character builds so that the most recent class that you took level 1 in has the casting stat that you want to use. So if you want to use Charisma for your items, you should make sure that you are taking a Charisma class as your most recent new casting class. That adds some extra complexity to building your characters, because it does mean that for spellcasters, who often are the characters that you want to be casting from scrolls, you need to make sure that you take your classes in the right order in order to avoid having those be ineffective tools as you play through the game. So hopefully this gives you some idea of how the formula works and how to arrange building your characters so that you don't make those tools useless as you play through the game. But now that we know how it works, I think there's also a fairly important other question to ask, and one that I've been asked a lot and that I have myself, and that is why? Why do item DCs work this way? Why is it such a complicated formula with so many exceptions? Why does it care about leveling your characters in a certain order when almost nothing else in the game cares about leveling your characters in a certain order? And the answer to that is, I just don't know. I don't know why they did it this way. As far as I know, no one knows. I don't think we've gotten an answer from Larian as to why they did it this way, or even whether it was intentional. And my personal strong suspicion is that this was not an intentional design decision. I think it was most likely to be an artifact of, at some point in the design process, they had a more complex system attached to this, and this is a leftover piece of that. Or it's an artifact of how they coded calculating save DCs that they just never bothered to fix, and maybe didn't even know was happening, because only if you're doing a lot of multiclassing, which Larian didn't really test a lot for multiclass builds because a small percentage of players use them, will you ever actually run into this effect. So my suspicion is that this was not intentional and is just a weird artifact of some point in the design process that was accidentally left in the final product. This is not how it works in tabletop, so it's not something that they brought over from tabletop. And honestly, it could easily have been fixed. It just wasn't. So I just don't know why it works this way. It, in my opinion, adds unnecessary complexity and unnecessary traps for new players, with no benefit to the players, just making it so that you have to take your character levels in a certain order, restrict player in order to avoid having something weird that you probably don't even know is happen that makes your character worse, restrict player freedom and traps new players and causes half-hour video essays on YouTube about the weird mechanic here, which none of that really needed to happen. There's a lot of different ways that they could fix this, but my preferred solution is just to make it so that item DC just uses your highest mental stat. That would be the most intuitive way for any player. If you're a charisma character, you expect that a spell that you cast is going to use your charisma, even if you have 1 level of cleric. And there's no reason that shouldn't be true for scrolls or for your Illithid powers or whatever. The fact that it doesn't work that way yields these bizarre corner cases, and so should probably have been fixed, though it's so baked into the game at this point that obviously it won't be. But overall, it's something that you can easily work around once you know that it's there. It's just never explained anywhere in game. So knowing is the entire battle for this, and then you can build your characters in order to avoid falling into this trap. Alright, my friends, I hope you've enjoyed this sort of deep mechanic dive. I know this is a little different from the videos that I normally do, but honestly, there's so much confusion around this topic that I thought, and misinformation, that I thought it would be useful to put all of the information in one place and maybe give people a more complete picture of how the characters actually work under the hood. So hopefully you've enjoyed it, and hopefully you found it helpful. If you are a newer player, then maybe this let you avoid a trap that you were going to fall into. And if you're a veteran player, maybe it cleared up some misconceptions that have been very persistent throughout the lifetime of the game. As always, of course, if you have enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment. And if you have any questions about specific character combinations or how it's going to work, or specific spells or items and whether what save DC and things that they use, definitely let me know in the comments, and I will do my best to clear those up. And of course, as always, if you've enjoyed the video, feel free to leave a comment and hit like. Helps me out with the algorithm, so I appreciate you taking the time to do that. And of course, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 guides and other strategy game analysis. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.